Right now, somewhere in your wallet or purse, there's a small card with 9 digits on it. Those 9 digits follow you from the moment you're born until long after you're dead. They determine whether you can get a job, open a bank account, file your taxes, buy a house, or even see a doctor. Without those 9 digits, you essentially do not exist in modern America. And yet, for the first 160 years of this country's history, none of that existed. There was no social security number. There was no universal system for tracking a single American citizen from birth to death. No 9-digit code tattooed onto your bureaucratic soul the moment you entered the world. So the question becomes, and it's one that most people have never really stopped to think about, how on earth did the United States government keep track of over 100 million people without it? The answer is both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Because for most of American history, the government didn't really track you at all, not in any systematic, centralized way. You were born, you lived, you died, and unless you owned land, paid certain taxes, committed a crime, or served in the military, there was a good chance the federal government had almost no record that you ever existed. The story of how America went from that kind of radical anonymity to a world where a single number defines your entire identity is really the story of how modern state power was built, crisis by crisis, war by war, and how a country that was founded on the principle of limited government slowly constructed one of the most comprehensive systems of citizen surveillance and identification the world has ever seen. Let me take you back to the very beginning. When the United States Constitution was ratified in 1788, the founders embedded one critical requirement into Article 1, Section 2. The government was required to conduct what they called an actual enumeration, a physical count of every person living in the country, once every 10 years. This wasn't done out of curiosity. It was done for one very specific political purpose, to determine how many representatives each state would receive in the House of Representatives. That was it. The census wasn't designed to track individuals. It wasn't designed to build a database of citizens. It was a head count, and a crude one at that. The first census took place in 1790, just over a year after George Washington was inaugurated. Congress assigned the job to the United States Marshals, the same men whose primary role was to enforce federal law and hunt down fugitives. There were roughly 650 of these marshals and their assistants tasked with counting every single person in a country that stretched across nearly 870,000 square miles of wilderness, farmland, coastal towns, and frontier settlements. They had no standardized forms. The federal government didn't even provide blank printed questionnaires. In most states, marshals had to supply their own paper and write out the schedules by hand. Only in Massachusetts did a marshal bother to print uniform forms, and he paid for them out of his own pocket. The questions were staggeringly simple. The marshals recorded only the name of the head of each household, not the wife, not the children, not the servants or boarders, just the head of household. Everyone else in the home was reduced to a tally mark, sorted into a handful of crude categories: free white males over 16, free white males under 16, free white females, all other free persons, and enslaved people. That was it. No ages, no occupations, no birthplaces. If you were a woman, a child, or an enslaved person, you were literally a number on a page, not even a name. The entire identity of millions of Americans was compressed into a single tick mark scratched onto a scrap of paper by a wandering marshal who may or may not have been sober. And the pay for this work was so abysmal that one federal judge reported difficulty finding anyone at all willing to do the job. Census takers were paid based on how many people they counted, typically around a penny per person in rural areas and slightly more in cities. For months of grueling travel on horseback through swamps and forests and mountain passes, often sleeping outdoors and eating whatever they could find, most of them earned less than a common laborer. It's no surprise, then, that the 1790 census was riddled with errors. President Washington himself believed the count was inaccurate, suspecting that the true population was higher than the 3.9 million the census reported. But the key point here is this: the census was a snapshot taken once a decade. It told the government how many people were in a given household on a single day. It did not track those people over time. It did not follow them when they moved. It did not record their births or deaths between census years. And critically, it did not assign any kind of individual identifier. If a man named John Smith appeared on the 1790 census in Virginia and then moved to Kentucky by 1800, there was no system whatsoever to connect those two records. He might as well have been two completely different people, and in many cases, that's exactly what happened. People reinvented themselves constantly. They changed their names, lied about their ages, moved across state lines, and vanished from the historical record entirely. This was the reality of American identity for the first 60 years of the Republic. The government knew, roughly, how many people lived in each state, but it had almost no ability to identify, track, or monitor specific individuals. And honestly, that's the way most Americans wanted it. Now, the census did slowly become more sophisticated over time. The 1850 census was a genuine turning point. For the first time, every free person in a household was recorded by name, not just the head of household. The census began collecting specific ages, occupations for those over 15, places of birth, and the value of real estate owned. Suddenly, the government was gathering real biographical data on individual Americans. But even this was still a snapshot, a once-a-decade freeze frame. The census couldn't tell you what happened to a person between 1850 and 1860. If they died, if they moved, if they changed jobs, if they got married, those events fell into a vast informational void. So if the census wasn't tracking people in any meaningful ongoing way, what was? The answer, perhaps surprisingly, is that it was a patchwork of local and state systems, most of them designed for purposes that had nothing to do with identifying citizens. The most important of these were property and tax records. From the very earliest days of the colonies, local governments kept records of who owned land and who owed taxes. These records were maintained at the county level, not the federal level, and they served a purely financial function. If you owned a farm in Virginia, the county knew about it because the county wanted to tax it. The records might include your name, the location and size of your property, sometimes a rough valuation, and occasionally the names of neighboring landowners. But if you didn't own property, you were largely invisible to this system. And for most of early American history, a significant portion of the population, including women, enslaved people, tenant farmers, and the urban poor, owned nothing at all. There were also poll taxes, sometimes called head taxes or capitation taxes, which were levied on individuals rather than property. These were ancient instruments dating back to colonial times and beyond, and they created lists of adult males who owed a fixed amount simply for existing within a jurisdiction. In Virginia, for example, personal property tax rolls beginning in 1782 recorded the names of white males over 21 and, horrifyingly, counted enslaved people as taxable property alongside horses and cattle. Free men of color didn't even appear by name on Virginia's tax lists until 1866, after the Civil War. So, while tax records did create some identification of individuals, they were selective, exclusionary, and scattered across thousands of local jurisdictions, with no standardization whatsoever. Then there was the matter of vital records, births, marriages, and deaths. Today we take it for granted that when a child is born, a government-issued birth certificate is created. But for most of American history, no such thing existed at the federal level, and many states didn't require birth registration until well into the 20th century. Before the Civil War, the recording of births and deaths was almost entirely in the hands of churches. If you were baptized, the church kept a record. If you were married in a ceremony, the church or the local magistrate might record it. If you died, a church or private burial ground might note the date. But these records were maintained by private institutions, not the state. They were inconsistent, often incomplete, and they were certainly not accessible to the federal government. A child born on a remote farm in 1820 might have no documented record of their existence whatsoever, not a birth certificate, not a baptismal record, nothing. That child could grow up, live an entire life, and die without the government ever officially acknowledging they had been alive. This is a concept that is genuinely difficult for modern people to grasp. We live in a world of total documentation. Every transaction, every movement, every interaction leaves a digital trace. But for the first century and a half of American history, it was entirely possible, and actually quite common, to exist completely outside any governmental record system. You could be born, live for 70 years, and die, and the only evidence you ever existed might be a faded entry in a family Bible. Now, there were moments when the federal government did attempt to identify specific individuals. The most notable of these was during wartime. Military service records are some of the oldest and most detailed individual records the American government ever created. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress maintained muster rolls listing the names, ranks, and sometimes physical descriptions of soldiers. During the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate armies kept extensive enlistment records, including a soldier's age, height, eye color, hair color, complexion, place of birth, and occupation. These were among the most detailed individual descriptions the government had ever compiled. But they applied only to men who served in the military, a fraction of the total population. The Civil War also brought another first, the nation's first federal income tax. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Internal Revenue Act, creating the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the ancestor of today's IRS, and imposing a 3% tax on incomes between $600 and $10,000, with a 5% tax on incomes above that threshold. To collect this tax, the government divided the country into collection districts and appointed local assessors, who compiled alphabetical lists of every person and business liable for taxation. These lists included names, addresses, and income amounts, remarkably detailed individual records for the time. But here's the thing, this income tax was explicitly a wartime measure. Public opposition was fierce, and Congress began cutting the rates almost immediately after the war ended. By 1872, the federal income tax was abolished entirely. It would not return permanently until the 16th Amendment was ratified in 1913, more than 4 decades later. During those intervening decades, over 90% of all federal revenue came from taxes on liquor, beer, wine, and tobacco. The government simply had no mechanism and no particular desire to track the incomes of individual citizens. Immigration records represent another crucial thread in this story. The Steerage Act of 1819 was the first federal law requiring ship captains arriving in American ports to submit passenger manifests to customs officials. These manifests listed each passenger's name, age, sex, occupation, and nationality. Over the following decades, the requirements became more detailed. By the time Ellis Island opened in 1892, immigration manifests had expanded to include birthplace, last residence, the name of the nearest relative in the immigrant's home country, and the name and address of whoever was meeting them in the United States. Between 1820 and 1957, the Port of New York alone processed over 23 million arrivals. But these records tracked entry, not ongoing residency. Once an immigrant passed through the gates of Ellis Island or Castle Garden before it, they were free. There was no system to follow up, no check-in requirement, no ongoing monitoring. An immigrant could arrive, give their name as Giuseppe Bianchi, walk out the door, and immediately begin calling themselves Joseph White. And many did exactly that. The government had a record of arrival, but that record was essentially disconnected from everything that came after. It sat in a filing cabinet at the port of entry, gathering dust. There was no centralized database linking that arrival record to a tax record, a census entry, a marriage license, or anything else. Each system existed in its own silo, maintained by different agencies at different levels of government, with no common identifier linking them together. And that is the crucial insight. Before 1936, there was no common identifier. No single number or code that followed an individual across different government systems. Your census record had no connection to your tax record. Your immigration manifest had no connection to your military service file. Your marriage license, if one existed, had no connection to your property deed. Each of these records existed independently, maintained by different bureaucracies at the local, state, and federal level, with no way to link them together. If the government wanted to know everything about a specific person, someone would have to physically travel to multiple courthouses, archives, and government offices in different jurisdictions and manually piece together the fragments. It was, in every sense, a system designed for a world in which the government simply did not need to know very much about you. But the world was changing. And by the early 20th century, the forces that would eventually demand a universal identification system were already gathering strength. The 16th Amendment in 1913 brought back the permanent federal income tax, which meant the government once again needed to track individual earnings. But even then, the system relied on names and addresses, not unique identifiers. If two men named John Smith lived in the same city and filed taxes, distinguishing between them required manual cross-referencing and a fair amount of guesswork. The system was clunky, error-prone, and vulnerable to fraud on a massive scale. Then came the Great Depression. By 1933, the American economy had essentially collapsed. Banks were failing by the hundreds. Unemployment had surged past 25%. Entire families were living in cardboard shanty towns. And perhaps most devastatingly, poverty among the elderly had reached catastrophic levels. More than half of all senior citizens in America were living in poverty. They had no pensions, no savings, no safety net whatsoever. When you got too old to work, you either relied on your family, went to a poorhouse, or you starved. It was a crisis of human suffering on a scale the country had never experienced, and it demanded a response that was equally unprecedented. President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office in March of 1933 with a mandate to act. He assembled a committee on economic security, led by his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, the first woman ever to serve in a presidential cabinet. The committee's task was to design a system that would protect American workers against the worst ravages of old age, unemployment, and disability. What they came up with was the Social Security Act, which Roosevelt signed into law on August 14, 1935. It established a system of old age benefits for workers, unemployment insurance, and aid for dependent mothers and children. It was the most ambitious piece of social legislation in American history. But here was the problem. To make Social Security work, the government needed to track every covered worker's earnings over the course of their entire career. Not just once a decade, like the census, not just for a few years, during wartime, like the Civil War income tax, permanently, from the moment they entered the workforce until the moment they retired or died. And to do that, they needed something America had never had before, a universal individual identifier. The Social Security Board, the agency created to administer the new program, faced an almost impossible logistical challenge. The act set a deadline of January 1937 to begin collecting payroll taxes from the first 26 million workers covered by the program. That gave the board less than a year and a half to hire thousands of employees, create a national network of offices, and figure out how to assign a unique number to every eligible worker in the country. And they had to do all of this from scratch, because nothing like it had ever been attempted before. The board initially considered using a combination of letters and numbers for the identifier, with 3 alphabetic characters representing geographic areas and 5 numeric characters for the individual. But when they consulted with other federal agencies, they discovered a problem. The Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and other statistical agencies all use purely numeric identifiers because their tabulating machines, the primitive computing devices of the era, could only process numbers. If the Social Security number included letters, these agencies and countless private companies would have to purchase entirely new machines. So the board scrapped the alphanumeric scheme and settled on a purely numeric identifier, 9 digits long, divided into 3 segments. The first 3 digits originally indicated the geographic area where the number was issued. The middle 2 were administrative group numbers. The final 4 were serial numbers assigned sequentially within each group. But assigning numbers was only half the battle. The board also needed to physically distribute Social Security cards to tens of millions of workers, and they needed to do it fast. They didn't have a network of offices yet. They didn't have an army of bureaucrats ready to fan out across the country. So they turned to the one federal institution that already reached into every community in America, the United States Postal Service. The postal carriers who visited nearly every house in the country became the front line of America's first universal identification system. They distributed and collected applications for Social Security numbers. Over 1,000 post offices were designated as typing centers where workers would physically type up each Social Security card by hand. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity, and it also served a psychological purpose. Americans were deeply suspicious of this new program. Many were genuinely frightened at the prospect of giving the government a number that could be used to track them. By using the familiar, trusted postal carrier as the point of contact rather than some faceless federal bureaucrat, the government was able to lower resistance. You weren't handing your personal information to a stranger. You were giving it to the mailman. Still, the controversy was real and fierce. Many Republicans in Congress attacked Social Security as government overreach, as an invasion of the private sphere. The 1936 presidential election turned partly on this issue. Republican candidate Alf Landon campaigned aggressively against Social Security, calling it a cruel hoax and warning that the government would use the numbers to regiment and control the population. Some employers even inserted notices in their workers' pay envelopes warning that Social Security would reduce their wages and that the government could never be trusted to pay the benefits it promised. There were genuine fears, not entirely unfounded as history would show, that a universal identification number could become a tool of authoritarian control. But Roosevelt won the election in a landslide, and Social Security moved forward. The first numbers were issued sometime in mid-November of 1936. By the end of 1937, roughly 37 million numbers had been assigned. It was the largest peacetime bureaucratic operation in American history. On December 1st, 1936, a man named Joseph Fay, head of the Division of Accounting Operations at the Social Security Board's headquarters in Baltimore, walked over to the first stack of 1,000 processed records and pulled the top one off the pile. He declared it the official first Social Security record. It belonged to a 23-year-old named John David Sweeney, Jr. of New Rochelle, New York. Newspapers across the country ran the story the next day, and Sweeney became, symbolically at least, the first American to be assigned a Social Security number. In a delicious irony, Sweeney came from a wealthy Republican family and had voted for Landon, the man who wanted to abolish the very program that had just made Sweeney famous. But the actual lowest number ever issued, the very first in numerical sequence, belonged to a woman named Grace D. Owen of Concord, New Hampshire. Her application simply happened to be the first one processed in the geographic area, assigned the lowest area number. She didn't know she held the distinction for years. Now, the Social Security number was designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to track the earnings history of workers covered by the Social Security program. The original Social Security card even said, right on its face, that it was not to be used for identification purposes, but almost immediately, other government agencies saw the usefulness of having a universal individual identifier and began latching onto it. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. In 1943, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9397, which required all federal agencies to use the Social Security number whenever they set up a new identification system for individuals. This was a wartime efficiency measure, but it fundamentally changed the nature of the number. It was no longer just a Social Security tracking code. It was becoming a universal federal identifier. The military adopted it. The Veterans Administration adopted it. And once federal agencies were using it, the private sector followed. In 1962, The Internal Revenue Service began requiring taxpayers to include their Social Security number on all federal tax returns. This was the moment the number became truly inescapable. You could theoretically live your whole life without collecting Social Security benefits, but you could not legally earn income in the United States without filing a tax return. And now your tax return required your Social Security number. The number had gone from optional to mandatory for every working American. Then came Medicare in 1965, which tied health coverage for the elderly to the same number. A 1970 law required banks and financial institutions to collect Social Security numbers from all customers. A 1976 law mandated that states collect them for driver's licenses and motor vehicle registrations. By the 1980s, you needed a Social Security number to claim a child as a dependent on your taxes, which meant that parents were applying for numbers for their newborn babies. What had begun as a simple earnings tracking tool for a retirement program had metastasized into the backbone of American identity itself. And this transformation produced some genuinely absurd consequences along the way. Perhaps the most famous involves a woman named Hilda Schrader Witcher of Lockport, New York. In 1938, just 2 years after the first Social Security numbers were issued, a wallet manufacturer called the E.H. Foray Company decided to promote its products by showing customers how a Social Security card would fit neatly inside their wallets. The company's vice president, a man named Douglas Patterson, thought it would be clever to include a sample card in each wallet. But instead of using a fictional number, Patterson used the actual Social Security number of his secretary, Hilda Witcher. The wallets were sold at Woolworth stores and other department stores across the country. The sample card was half the size of a real Social Security card, was printed entirely in red ink, and had the word specimen written across its face. It was obviously not a real card. And yet, thousands upon thousands of Americans bought the wallet, found the card inside, and simply adopted the number as their own. Whether they genuinely believed the card was theirs, or whether they just needed a number quickly for a new job and didn't understand the system, is impossible to say. But at the peak of the madness in 1943, nearly 5,800 people were simultaneously using Hilda Witcher's Social Security number. The FBI showed up at her door to investigate. Her coworkers teased her by singing a popular song of the era, calling her the $1 Million Baby from the 5 and 10 cent store. The Social Security Administration voided her number and issued her a new one, but the damage was done. Over the following decades, more than 40,000 people reported Hilda's number as their own. As late as 1977, nearly 4 decades after the wallets were first sold, a dozen people were still using it. The whole episode perfectly encapsulates just how new and poorly understood the concept of a universal identifier was in those early years. People literally had no framework for understanding what a Social Security number was, what it meant, or why each person needed their own unique one. And in a way, that confusion hasn't entirely gone away. The Social Security number was never designed to be a secure identifier. It has no built-in verification mechanism. It's just a number. Anyone who knows it can use it. There's no photo attached, no biometric data, no encryption. It was designed in the 1930s for a world of paper files and punch cards, and we're still using it in the age of the internet, where a single data breach can expose millions of numbers simultaneously. The Equifax breach of 2017 alone compromised the Social Security numbers of roughly 147 million Americans, nearly half the country's population. And yet, we continue to use this antique system because replacing it would require rebuilding virtually every government database and private sector record system in the country. But stepping back from the modern frustrations, there's a deeper question worth sitting with. For 160 years, America managed to function, to govern, to tax, to fight wars, to build an industrial economy, all without a universal identification number. People were known by their names, their faces, their reputations, their communities. Your identity was not a number in a database. It was a network of relationships and local knowledge. The village knew who you were because the village had watched you grow up. The bank knew you because the banker had shaken your hand. The tax collector knew you because he lived 3 houses down. That world is gone. And it didn't disappear because of some grand conspiracy or some deliberate power grab. It disappeared because modern economies require modern infrastructure. And modern infrastructure requires the ability to track millions of individual transactions across vast distances and long periods of time. You cannot administer retirement benefits for 330 million people using the honor system and a handshake. You cannot collect income taxes from a mobile, anonymous population without some way to identify who owes what. The Social Security number emerged not from tyranny, but from necessity, from the practical demands of governing a complex industrial society in crisis. But the fact that it was necessary doesn't mean it was designed well, or that its expansion into a universal identifier was inevitable. The original architects of Social Security explicitly warned against using the number for anything other than tracking earnings. They put a disclaimer on the card itself. And yet, agency by agency, law by law, The number crept into every corner of American life, driven not by some master plan, but by the simple bureaucratic impulse to use whatever identifier was already available rather than create a new one. Today, that 9-digit number is the single most valuable piece of personal information an American possesses. It is the key to your financial identity, your credit history, your tax obligations, your health insurance, your employment eligibility, and increasingly, your ability to function in society at all. It was designed as a bookkeeping tool for a retirement program. It became the closest thing America has ever had to a national identity card, a country that has always been philosophically opposed to the very concept. And perhaps that's the deepest irony of all. America never wanted a national ID system. The founders built a government of limited, enumerated powers precisely because they feared the kind of centralized authority that such a system implies. And yet, through a combination of economic crisis, bureaucratic inertia, and the relentless logic of administrative convenience, that is exactly what we got. Not through a single dramatic act of legislation, but through decades of incremental expansion, each step seeming reasonable on its own, until one day Americans woke up and realized that a number assigned at birth now follows them to the grave and beyond. So the next time you're asked to provide those 9 digits on a job application, a loan form, a doctor's intake sheet, remember that, for most of American history, none of this existed. Your great-great-grandparents lived and died without a number. They were known by their names, their deeds, their communities. Whether that was better or worse is a question worth asking. But what is certain is that the world we live in now, a world where identity is a number and privacy is a luxury, would be completely unrecognizable to the people who founded this country. And the system that made it all possible, this accidental national identifier, born from the desperation of the Great Depression, continues to shape American life in ways its creators never imagined and almost certainly never intended. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means the world to me. And if you haven't already, check out our video on how the Federal Reserve was secretly created on a private island. I think you'll find it just as revealing. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.